go. All right. Hello and welcome everyone to, well, it's the lecture's going to turn and take a turn for the worse for today because we're going into what's called the crisis of confidence. Now, we don't have as many people as we normally would have, and hopefully that means that people are actually watching the recordings because if you don't have the lecture down, you're not probably not going to do well on the test. Um, so it's kind of vitally important to you know attend. All right, so first of all, we had a test, and I probably should have pulled that up earlier, but I did not. We had a test last week, and so let's go over the answers to that. Hold on a second while I pull it up. Quiz 3. Yeah, there we go. So, the first question on the quiz was, what purpose did red baiting serve during the second Red Scare? Um, the options were expose communists, B, catching red herrings, C, protect U.S. democracy, or D, demonize political opposition. The answer was D. Um, they talked about protecting U.S. democracy in that, but that wasn't the real purpose, was it? Red baiting is always a underhanded tactic to silence your opposition. Um, Also, you can probably tell the B was a joke. Um, so number 2 is when was mutually assured destruction possible? Um, A, when World War II ended. B, second strike capability. C, functional ballistic missiles. Or D, Soviet nuclear weapons. The answer was B. Um, in fact, the term mutually assured destruction did not was not coined until a year after Ike announced the second strike capability. So that was in the Cold War lecture. In fact, both of these were in the Cold War lecture. Um, this one, though, is from the readings. Why were the Almanac singers complaining about FDR in the Ballad of October 16th? Now, each of those answers, I'm not going to read the whole thing, are actually from the song, but you'll notice that I'm using those quotes misleadingly so that you can um, figure so that if you had listened to the song, you would know it was Peacetime Draft. Um, they're complaining about getting drafted into the military when the U.S. had not declared war yet. Um, so the uh, the um, the rest of those are things that are kind of offhanded from the song. You could kind of get that, but the main thing was the peacetime draft. Um, so number 4, what created the golden age of capitalism? This is from that the boom years of the 1950s lecture. So A, returning veterans. B, military industrial complex. C, sole superpower after World War II. Or D, all of the above. It's all of the above. Um, Most of you guys got that one correct. There, I think only one person didn't get it correct. Um, so, and number 5, which technique won the civil rights movement the most favor? A, civil disobedience. B, massive resistance. C, militancy. Or D, the Double V campaign. The answer was civil disobedience. Um, Massive resistance is referring to how racists in Congress tried to resist civil rights. Militancy is kind of, you know, Black Power movement and all that kind of stuff that didn't exactly win a lot of favor for the continuance of the civil rights movement, especially when militancy was related to riots and whatnot. And the Double V campaign didn't really go anywhere. It was a hopeful idea, but it didn't have any kind of force behind it. So civil disobedience is really what won favor. So with that being said, I think the class average was above a B. So you guys did no, it was slightly below a B. But realize the quizzes are not worth a lot of your grade. They're just to show to make you think, to make you rethink the lectures and rethink the readings. This will probably be the last quiz. I don't, unless I see a need to do that, considering we don't have as many people in here as we should. Normally there's around 12, and today there's 8. Um, and um, that's that might mean another quiz if we keep on seeing this low of attendance. But otherwise, normally that would be the last quiz. With that being said, any questions on the questions, the quizzes, your grades? Just put like a thumbs up or anything if we're all good. Cool. All right. And say hello to my cat. So let me switch to screen share. And today we're going to be talking about the crisis of confidence. One historian called the 1970s the pivotal decade. And the thing about it being a pivotal decade is that it was a pivot to the right of politics. Basically because it was a decade full of political scandals and economic malaise. And malaise meaning like bad times. This will culminate in a speech called the Malaise Speech, which you guys are assigned to read. So this kind of thing, this decade is important not just because of it's like the end of the hippies and the end of the Vietnam War and all that kind of stuff, but it's the beginning of our current political system as we shifted further and further to the right and continue to do so today. So switch, thank you. So the scandals began right at the beginning of the decade. Arguably even before it. So the Kennedys were kind of the preeminent political family in the 1960s. After all, JFK came to power, and then Bobby Kennedy was assassinated in 1968. So it fell on the least of the Kennedy brothers, Ted Kennedy, to kind of carry that mantle of progressivism, of New England progressivism, because they're all from Massachusetts. And well, Ted Kennedy was out drinking one night and drove his car into a little channel. He escaped from the car, but the girl that he had alongside him did not, and she drowned to death. And this became quite the scandal, which ultimately dashed Kennedy's hopes for a 1972 run at the presidency, and is kind of seen as the end of the Kennedy family as a significant political force. Though Ted Kennedy would remain in the Senate and, in fact, earn the moniker the Lion of the Senate. But Chappaquiddick, where he killed that girl, um, remained this kind of pall over his political career. Hence why he did try to run in 1980 as well, but that was running after he was trying to oust a incumbent Democrat through primarying him, and that almost never works. It hasn't worked since the 1880s. Um, but um, the this was the end of what's often called social liberalism. We've talked a little bit about social liberalism in that, but essentially that kind of New Deal progressivism um, was dashed in the channel at Chappaquiddick. Um, so Nixon managed to get second um, a second um, term, despite the fact that there's all this. I mean, basically, because of all this stuff going on with the Democrats and the Kennedy family. It's sometimes called the Kennedy curse because of just how many Kennedys ended up dying young. Um, which actually began in World War II rather than with Kennedy in 1963. Um, but the scandals didn't stop there. That wasn't Chappaquiddick was in 1969 and 1971. There was a release of several papers called the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times. This guy named Daniel Ellis smuggled a bunch of secret classified papers to the New York Times and released them, kind of the same thing as Edward Snowden did. But unlike Snowden, he actually stayed around to face the consequences of his actions. And these papers revealed that the federal government had been lying about the Vietnam War pretty much from the beginning, and in fact showed that the U.S. had been bombing Laos, something that um, that various presidents had actually claimed that what wasn't going on, even though it absolutely was, um, and also kind of showed this assassination and torture program that the CIA and special forces had going on in Vietnam. So this rocked the credibility of the federal government when it came to the Vietnam War. Mind you, there's still 2 years left of the Vietnam War as these papers start coming out, even though they come out as a trickle. Um, Nixon, in fact, he was president at this point, and he was trying to silence Ellsberg. Um, to is it Ellsberg or Ellis? I think it's Ellsberg, Daniel Ellsberg. Um, and he tried to silence Ellsberg through like blackmailing, and that didn't work. Though he was prosecuted for under the Espionage Act because, well, he was releasing classified information. Um, he would eventually be his sentence would eventually be commuted, and he would never see a day in prison. Um, but that man's fate was in the air for a few years because of all this. But Nixon got reelected, and there's some there's some weird shenanigans that happened during the 1972 election. Um, a bunch of thieves broke into the Democratic headquarters at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C., to steal a bunch of information about like their voter rolls and that kind of thing, so that the clear intent was so that they could get insider information on the Democrats and be able to use that for mudraking. Didn't work out. They were caught. And then that scandal just kind of went quiet for a little bit. In the meantime, um, and it going quiet is quite important here. Understand it. Um, it signified something was going on in the background, but the Justice Department continued to investigate it, and the newspapers moved on to the next crisis, which was the 1973 oil crisis. Because of U.S. support of the Yom Kippur War in Israel, where Israel basically fought mostly Egypt, though a bit of Syria as well, over territory in that. The U.S. supported Israel, whereas the USSR was supporting the Arab League, well, chunks of the Arab League, including Egypt and Syria. And this led to, those oil producing countries to decide we need to do something about US support of Israel. And so they had formed a group called OPEC that that was an oil producing cartel. The OP in OPEC stands for oil producing. And so OPEC countries in 1973 cut off US access to their oil. This is often called the Nixon shock. This came right after what's often called the Nixon shock, which is when Nixon completely removed the US from the gold standard. You might recall that we were kind of on the gold standard, even though regular citizens did not have access to it. International currency was backed up by the US dollar, and the US dollar was backed up by gold. So Fort Knox was created purely, it already existed, but was used to just shuffle around gold between countries in its basement. So the Nixon made the US completely fiat currency, as inflation was starting to become a problem. But we'll see, that did not solve the problem. So on top of that, the oil crisis happens. And so it got to the point where people are waiting for these long lines to get gasoline for their cars. Remember, the US very much runs on gasoline even today. And so there'd be these rationings so that people with license plates that end in even numbers can get it on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesdays, and people who have license plates that end in odd numbers can get gas on the other days. So it kind of worked it got to that point, and of course gas prices skyrocketed with all of this. And although proportionally today, gas prices are often actually worse than they were in 1973, but this is a point in time when gas is just dirt cheap. So this is a whole new problem, which means that the US becomes more and more involved in the Middle East to try to prevent this kind of thing from happening again. So this is where we start seeing a foreign policy shift from just kind of this weird benefactor of stuff in the Middle East just to fight communism and that, to trying to make sure that oil is still flowing. And we'll see later on in this lecture that that didn't exactly work out either. But the Nixon, while he had been elected to get the U.S. out of the Vietnam War, and he had started Vietnamization and all that kind of stuff, there were very few troops left in 1972. and by 73 we had pulled out. The Nixon administration took great umbrage with the anti-war movement. He was talking about peace with honor. That's why if you ever see him doing the V sign, you've seen those pictures where he's got like two V's. That means that's V for victory. Um, that's and that's where we start seeing the change from V for victory to this being a symbol of peace, is kind of in opposition to Nixon and his usage of that symbol. But he also decided to do something about the anti-war protests and so he used what were known as the White House Plumbers, a group of FBI anti-protester and political operatives that worked for Nixon. These plumbers would go and mind you, the name plumber is a euphemism. Obviously, they weren't doing any plumbing besides plumbing the political opposition. So they'd like infiltrate anti-war organizations to kind of destroy them from the inside using blackmail and threats and threats of government intervention in them and everything. And publicly, Nixon labeled all dissent as un-American. That there was some sort of silent majority. He constantly used this term silent majority that was opposed to these anti-war protests and that had continued throughout his administration. So that crushing of dissent became quite well understood. This was, even though the plumbers were using a bunch of secretive and underhanded techniques, it's not like people didn't know about it. It was in the newspaper all the time. And then right after Nixon gets reelected in that, Spiro Agnew, his vice president, he had previously been a governor, and the Justice Department caught wind that he had taken bribes when he was there for giving good contracts, and so Spiro Agnew started to get prosecuted for that, and he resigned in disgrace because of the scandal, bringing Gerald Ford, the guy that you can see right down here, into the vice presidency through appointment. So Gerald Ford was never elected, not even as vice president. But then that whole Watergate scandal started to come about right after Spiro Agnew got prosecuted. And so even though Nixon had actually won by a landslide, he got more than 60% of the popular vote, which is actually more than we've seen for any president since. Nixon in 1972 was basically the most popular president we've had since then, oddly enough. And he actually got, because of that, he actually got 96.8% of the electoral vote. So nearly 90, so only 3% of electors even voted against him because of that. But it turned out that Nixon had used the White House plumbers to cover up the uh, the Watergate scandal to make it go away, um, through you know political threats and to local police and that. Um, and there's still kind of an open question on whether or not he had ordered the Watergate break-in in the first place. But the scandal was ultimately that he tried to cover it up, um, by bribing police and that, and make it go away. So the Department of Justice was building up this case, and um, clearly they didn't really want to go against the power of the presidency. After all, the DOJ is actually part of the executive branch, so they'd have to be prosecuting themselves, basically. Um, and so a FBI director named Mark Felt um, leaked the information of this investigation to a couple of reporters named Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. So Woodward and Bernstein broke the news of this investigation, and so that resulted in the in um, in the Senate opening up hearings on that, and even starting to work towards the House starting to work towards articles of impeachment. So Nixon was facing impeachment for all this, and his first reaction to all this was to try to fire um, all those DOJ people who had leaked the information. And interestingly enough, by the way, he didn't know that it was Mark Felt who leaked it, because Mark Felt had given Woodward and Bernstein the information under a interesting pseudonym. He was known as Deep Throat because that movie had just come out. That pornography movie had just come out, and it was extremely popular. Um, so uh, weird callback to all the 60s culture stuff. Um, so um, as these investigations picked up, Nixon kept on trying to obstruct them. He forced the resignation of all those DOJ people. That was known as the Saturday Night Massacre. The firing of all those DOJ people. We kind of saw the same thing happen with Trump when he started firing people because of their willingness to prosecute the insurrection earlier this year. Um, the It's not a good look. it's it's not a good look to be firing the people who are investigating this stuff, and so this amps up um, the investigation and the possible impeachment and all that kind of stuff. Um, and what really sparks it off is the Supreme Court ruled that that Nixon couldn't block access to his recordings um, for a congressional investigation. That congressional investigations have more power than the presidency to investigate these things, and therefore he couldn't hold it under executive privilege. Um, and in these tapes was what's called the smoking gun, where he literally is saying, like, we need to squash we need to squash this scandal that's happening because the Watergate break-in, squash it. And so that was the smoking gun. He was absolutely complicit in the cover-up. And so realizing that he was about to get impeached, as the articles of impeachment are getting ready to be voted on, Nixon resigns. Despite the fact that he had constantly said that he was not a crook, turns out he was. Um, so in August of 1974, our only president to resign resigned, um, rather than face impeachment. The this doesn't mean that there weren't people prosecuted for Watergate. It actually resulted in 48 federal convictions. So it's not like um, people weren't prosecuted for this. But Nixon was still facing impeachment. Resignation doesn't mean that you can't be impeached. And if you're impeached, the Senate can just choose your punishment. Your punishment can be as little as you're no longer in office to as big as capital punishment, as in execution. They have the power to do so if they because they get to just make up the rules on that. Um, and so, um, knowing that that this is going to be something that continues to hurt the country, especially if it goes all the way to the Senate, and that the former Vice President, now President Ford, um, who, mind you, was not elected. He was um, merely elevated because of Spiro Agnew's scandal. Ford, exactly a month after Nixon's resignation, pardons Nixon, basically meaning he's can't be prosecuted for it. Although the Congress still could have, made articles of impeachment in that, but by this point, just a month later, nobody wants to deal with the fallout. It is that remarkable of a scandal. So Watergate became the mother of all scandals. In fact, you'll hear things like there's currently a scandal going on with child trafficking and that with a House member, and it's called Gatesgate, or Getsgate, because his last name is Getz. So people started adding the name Gate at the end, named after the Watergate Hotel. Um, so the Watergate scandal, every time you hear the term gate at the end of a scandal, that's referring directly back to Watergate. That's how big of an issue this was. Um, and it didn't end there. The U.S. was in incredibly difficult um, economic circumstances with what's called stagflation. Um, so throughout the 1960s, the U.S. had deindustrialized quite a bit. Um, there was After World War II, the U.S. was in quite a great economic position where we were the industrial powerhouse of the world, and basically the rest of the industrialized world had gotten destroyed during World War II. But places like Japan, Germany, and even Russia had managed to bounce back, and were creating were industrializing at quite a rapid pace, to the point that it became cheaper to manufacture these goods elsewhere. And so a lot of US manufacturing declined throughout the 1960s. But this wasn't really felt until the 1970s, save for places like Detroit that became part of what's called the Rust Belt. The Rust Belt is the remnants, these cities up in the Northeast and Midwest that were industrial centers, and after deindustrialization, um, simply did not have jobs. That's the reason why Detroit is such a sad city as it is today, because it deindustrialized. Um, Ultimately resulting in the race riot in 1967 that kind of signified that Detroit was no longer a industrial powerhouse and couldn't keep a lid on its racial inequality. The um, so from prior to the 1960s, um, the U.S. had more than 30% of the world's industrial output. At the end of World War II, we had more than 50%. So there was actually a rapid decline in terms of our market share from there, but we didn't really need to expand. But by 1980, the U.S. only had 20%. So we lost more than 10% of the entire world's market share. This was this also decreased in terms of manufacturing jobs at home. Manufacturing jobs, if you graduated high school in the 1960s, you could pretty much expect to get a job at an industrial plant with that high school diploma. Nowadays, high school diplomas will only get you like a retail job at Walmart. And that's typically minimum wage. So with all of this, with this decline in industry, places like Detroit would be abandoned. Although, interestingly enough, there was what's called the Sun Belt. For instance, we are here in Albuquerque, we are considered part of the Sun Belt. And this kind of exodus of manufacturing jobs resulted in an inflow into what's called service jobs, and we'll get to that. But the Southwest really became the powerhouse of the service industry. Though places like Arkansas would also be considered part of the Sun Belt because that's where Walmart comes from. But in the meantime, there was this giant rise in unemployment. Unemployment had been quite low throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Most of the time, less than 3%. Imagine if we could get our economy below 3%. So it went above 3% in 1970. It was 3.8%. And by 1980, it was 9.8%. It had almost risen to 10%. And at no point was there a clear stock market crash or anything along those lines. This was not a depression, nor much of a recession. Something was going on economically that benefited elites, but not regular people, and that was deindustrialization. Because people with money could just invest in foreign capital, whereas people in the U.S. could not. So this globalization of industry led to a huge rise in unemployment. But it also resulted, because of the Nixon shock and because of this deindustrialization, it also resulted in inflation. So inflation hit some pretty crazy numbers. For instance, in 1980, it hit 12.4%. More than 12% inflation. And to make matters worse, the gross domestic product, of course, was hurt by deindustrialization as well, leading to stagnant growth. For instance, in 1970, the total GDP growth in 1970 was 0.2%. And while there would be some good years like 1972 where it got to 5.2%, most of the years of the 1970s were less than 1% GDP growth. So you have this massive inflation trend. You've got very low GDP growth. So the economy stagnated and there was massive inflation, hence why it's called stagflation. Now, up until this point, people figured that the economy worked on this thing called the Keynesian model. We talked about this during the Depression lecture. And the Keynesian model predicted that you could lower when there was stagnation in the economy, you could lower the forgetting the word for it, the percentage of credit per year, APR. There we go. And the Federal Reserve had power to control that they could say set the credit rate of federal bonds and that, which set the credit rate for everyone else. Basically, they would, when the economy wasn't looking too good, they'd lower that, and when it was fine, they'd raise it. But this counteracted that entire idea, because not only did the GDP stop growing, but inflation grew, which is exactly the opposite of what that model predicts. So Keynesian economics just couldn't deal with this new economy. And this new economy, which we are still in, is called the service economy. So the service sector is things like retail, finance, and technology. So, for instance, Walmart incorporated in 1969. Walmart is kind of the harbinger of the service economy. And in 1975, they had already had 125 stores nationwide. So they were already growing at a rapid rate throughout all of this. And of course, technology is a service sector job, and that and so like the manufacturing of technology is obviously industry, but instead the U.S. designs and innovates on technology and then relies on foreign countries to manufacture them. So we are the service of innovation, where other countries are industry. And Keynesian models just didn't really work with this service economy. And on top of all of this, just to make matters worse, another oil crisis hits in 1979 after the Iranian Revolution, which we'll cover in just a little bit. So just another economic crisis with people having to line up, as you can see. This is a picture from 1979. And, not being able, gas is going up. It's 85 cents a gallon when it used to be 50 cents. And so just a massive amount of inflation, stagnation, loss of industry jobs, and a complete reformulation of the American economy throughout all this. So you have this kind of economic malaise happening in the background of all this. While it certainly gets a lot of attention, what gets even more attention is political scandals that continued to go after Watergate. So Watergate kind of inspired a great deal of skepticism about the federal government, which in turn brought more investigations to see what kind of government malfeasance we'd just been missing. After the Pentagon Papers revealed how bad the Vietnam War had been, it was time to see what else the federal government had been doing. So a Senate committee led by Frank Church, a senator, investigated the FBI, the CIA, and the NSA for possible scandals. This led to a bunch of revelations that people were um, just finding out for the first time. For instance, the U.S. engaged in a bunch of drug tests throughout the late 50s and early 60s, um, to literally try to figure out if the CIA could have some sort of mind control drugs. This program was called MK Ultra, and the Church Committee revealed it, along with what is often called the Family Jewels Report, because back when Nixon took the presidency in 1969. Um, there was a change in leadership in a lot of federal agencies in that. And the CIA had a Republican leader all of a sudden for the first time since Ike. And, um, you know, Nixon wanted to get out of Vietnam and all that kind of stuff. And there seemed to be some sort of institutional opposition to that. And so they had ordered an investigation, which created the Family Jewels Report, which was essentially just a report of all of these different operations that the CIA had engaged in that were, you know, obviously repugnant. For instance, in California, they had periodically sprayed chemicals into the atmosphere to see how far it would spread, and literally would wait until people coming in with respiratory illnesses reported it. This was basically to test a biological weapon dispersal. Um, Now, it was a harmless chemical, but it was an irritant. And so it would hurt people who were especially elderly people with weaker lungs. And the CIA would just wait until those reports came in to see how good the dispersal went. Um, so literally engaging in basically chemical warfare domestically just to experiment is some pretty horrifying stuff, right? Um, the There's also a bunch of medical experimentation that was revealed with this, especially in the FBI. Um, the and what's particularly potent with this is that a lot of the medical experimentation um, was revealed to be extraordinarily racist. Now, you guys have probably heard of the Tuskegee experiments, but that was not part of this. That was actually one of the big misconceptions about the Tuskegee experiments is that they were drugging people. It's quite the opposite. They were refusing people drugs just to see how syphilis advanced in them. And this was a federal bureau, but it wasn't the FBI, CIA, or NSA. Um, but that was revealed during the 1950s. Um, the FBI had continued to sponsor medical experimentation on Black people actually well after the Church Committee, all the way into the 1980s. So there was lots of problems here. So this was the not only was it a huge scandal, but also the Ford administration kind of tried to preempt it by creating their own commission to investigate CIA wrongdoings called the Rockefeller Commission, or the President's Commission on CIA Activities within the United States, because the CIA specifically is not supposed to have any power within our borders. It is explicitly a foreign operation. Um, but um, the new vice president, Nelson Rockefeller, um, was kind of campaigning for these investigations and that, but um, it kind of went nowhere because Ford was using it to try to stop the Church Committee. And then another committee was formed in the House called the Pike Committee to do all the same thing. So you've got several investigations into CIA wrongdoing in that. And the Church Committee is going further than that, investigating the FBI and NSA. So beyond all of this, you might remember that there were a lot of assassinations during the 60s and that. So the House also created, right after all this Church Committee stuff broke out, the House created the House Select Committee on Assassinations, which was the second major investigation into the JFK assassination. But it ended up going further and showing that the CIA had engaged in assassinations throughout other countries, and revealed that the US had engaged in funding a bunch of paramilitary organizations in Italy, for instance, to fight communist paramilitary there, which had led to a long, almost civil war, basically a bunch of gang warfare for politics in Italy called the Years of Lead. And the CIA was revealed to have been engaged in all of this because of the HSCA. But the HSCA also cast doubt on the single shooter thesis of the JFK assassination. There'd been a lot of conspiracy theories about, was Kennedy, was there a second shooter and all that kind of stuff? Was the CIA involved? We know now that the HSCA just got their ballistics wrong. There's been tons of investigations to show that they just got it wrong. But this is where the idea of a magic bullet that somehow was able to weave through two people's bodies. In reality, that happens all the time. And if they just realized that the seat in the front of the car was actually lowered, if they had done just a modicum of actual due diligence, they could have squashed a lot of the stupid conspiracy theories out there. But they were less concerned with doing actual investigation, and they were more concerned with showing that they were doing something to stop the CIA's malfeasance. It was just more of this kind of stuff. And then came the Abscam scandal, which was kind of the FBI fighting back against all of this stuff, when the FBI created a sting operation to give fake bribes to congressmen, and and 8 of these congressmen actually fell for it and were prosecuted for bribery. But you could see that there's this kind of like overt fight going on between CIA, FBI, federal agencies, and Congress over accountability in that. So now even Congress is being shown to be unaccountable. This leads to congressional oversight over the CIA, and that there had, in 1974, there was the creation of the Hughes-Ryan Amendment, and was further amended by 1980 to create the Intelligence Oversight Committee. Basically, the various intelligence agencies now have to report to Congress, rather than it being solely an executive branch thing. And this has really tamped down on these abuses and that, though it's not as though they don't continue to happen. It's really stopped a lot of the really bad stuff. But of course, the public was not interested in the inner workings of congressional oversight in that. They saw these scandals in the news over and over and over again, and this led to a great deal of distrust and paranoia. Um, and so um, the American culture in general started to resemble this distrust of government, this, and even kind of openly celebrating things like conspiracy theories and that. You know, which I hope people are starting to come to realize that that conspiracy theorism ultimately is incredibly violent, and really ought not be countenanced. But um, people felt justified in making up stuff um, when there was so many things already being shown. That Family Jewels report was quite the upset. So this resulted in what Jimmy Carter would call cultural malaise. the So with deindustrialization and that, with the rise of the new left and all that, Hollywood kind of experienced a renaissance. It's called the Hollywood Renaissance, or New Hollywood. From the late 60s all the way to today, Hollywood took on a very different way of telling stories, and a lot of them were a lot less celebratory. And was especially this was readily apparent with the death of its most popular genre, the Western. There was at one point that Westerns made up 1/3 of all Hollywood releases. But there were hardly any after 1975. And this had to do with the general idea that American exceptionalism, this idea that we're a special country that deserving of praise for fighting for freedom, and that was dashed upon the rocks of all these scandals coming out throughout the 70s. And so the 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 hippies and that had really still had a hope for America in general, but the cultural malaise from all of this virtually ended that hope. Really signified by the dour turn that Hollywood took throughout the 70s. For instance, you guys might recognize this movie, and but most of you probably haven't seen it because the movie ends with a rape scene. There's several. There's suicide. There's like 3 murders. It's not happy go fun. Let's go dance at the disco thing. It's dark, and the darkness of the 70s wouldn't really turn around until 1977 with the release of Star Wars. In terms of Hollywood productions. And even that, if you go back and watch the original Star Wars, is a lot dirtier than later Star Wars would be, because New Hollywood was based on this kind of darkness. But with movies like this, you can see that there was a new genre coming alive with the emergence of disco. It came from um, the funk movement of the late 60s and early 70s. And the word comes from the word discoteca, which is basically dance hall in German. But it refers to discs in a library, as in, the DJ has to pull out a disc to play it. So disco became kind of the dominant genre of this, and it's while you can see that it's quite happy if you go back and listen to a lot of it, um, it's not. It's kind of escapism from this cultural malaise. It's a very obvious escapism when you go and watch movies like this. Um, the uh, the There's a great book called Staying Alive on all this stuff, and the problem was there's still a great deal of racism in the United States, and so disco became associated with colored music, as in race music, um, and groups um, like the Village People made it even worse for these cultural conservatives who didn't like disco because it was, black people, um, and groups like the Village People um, also heavily associated the movement with gay rights, and so these uh, these associations start making people hate disco, and that led to the Disco Sucks movement in 1979. And at a White Sox game, very prominently, a bunch of people invaded the baseball field and started what they called disco demolition night, where they publicly burned um, disco records in the field, and running around with signs saying "disco sucks" and all that kind of stuff. And this is seen as the end of disco, though really it drove disco underground and led to things like R&B and hip hop and that, which are rooted in this destruction of disco. Um, but beyond that, the kind of glitz and glam and um, escapism of disco and whatnot, and prog rock is another example of kind of escapism in music, led to um, some some rock musicians wanting to return to the basics, and but also continue that kind of new left tradition of dissent, and this led to punk music. Um, for instance, in 1974, the Ramones came together, and um, the throughout 1977, there was a what was then called a new wave of punk music. This new wave was um, often called American hardcore today. You had groups like Black Flag, Middle Class, Dead Kennedys, that kind of thing, um, that were um, had a real political bent, um, and so they never really got popular. But that term "new wave" got applied to what was then called post-punk, which was basically the merging of these kind of like disco techniques with the hard edge of with the hard kind of simplicity of punk music, which led to what's called new wave music in the 1980s. So you can see even music starts to really reflect this cultural malaise. And probably the best example of this cultural malaise was um, television. So in 1971, a TV show called All in the Family started up and ran for most of the decade, all the way until 79. And in fact, had a spin off going all the way into the 80s based around its working class protagonist named Archie Bunker. Um, and Archie Bunker was this like crass, racist, um, you know, openly bigoted white um working class fellow who was feeling the sting of this deindustrialization. And this became the most popular show of the 1970s. Um, Alongside it, that really showed this kind of disillusionment was a show that was actually a spin-off of a movie called MASH. It depicted a um, a what's called a MASH unit, a medical unit that was depicted as being in the Korean War. Um, you know, just to kind of avoid the direct parallels to the Vietnam War. But in 1970, the Vietnam War is still going on, and so it was quite obvious to everyone that the parallels were there. And 2 years later, they made it into a TV show. It's mostly a comedy, same with All in the Family, but um, there's some real darkness in the show. For instance, Mash's theme song in the movie was uncensored, but because of how dark the theme song was, the TV show wasn't allowed to actually play the lyrics because the name of the song is "Suicide is Painless." That's the actual name of the song. Um, and if you listen to the lyrics, it's pretty freaking dark. Um, so if you've ever seen MASH and heard that song, just realize what you're listening to. Um, so yeah, there's this heavy disillusionment and cultural malaise, um, and yet there are still hopes that. Do we have time? I don't think we have time. Um, there are still hopes that will ultimately be dashed throughout the 70s. Um, for instance, there is the Equal Rights Amendment, which we will talk about next time. Let's get out of um, here and um, let's talk about like how culture is influenced by economy, by um, political scandal and all that kind of stuff. Um, like the there's a lot of issues being worked out, even though things like Archie Bunker and MASH are not, you know, or Star Wars are not, specifically saying like, man, times suck. I guess I need to freaking do some Star Wars. Um, but it recontextualizes the way you view those products, right? So I'm sure, has everybody here seen Star Wars? Like, I'm just assuming everybody has. It's kind of a requirement. How does this make you like rethink Star Wars, like the original movie? When you see it in this larger cultural context, when you see it as part of this stagflation, deindustrialization, um, constant political scandals in that, like, what does Darth Vader suddenly start to seem like?
He definitely starts seeming like a corrupt politician.
Mm-hmm. You might recall from the movie. They talk about dissolving the Senate. They talk about um, they talk about uh, that there's corruption in the ranks on the Death Star and that where they're saying like, oh, Vader, shut up, we're talking politics, um, and that kind of thing. And yet you have this kind of like malignant force willing to just assassinate people. Like, you can easily see Darth Vader as the CIA. So if that's the case, especially when you start seeing those kind of like assassination parallels and this war going on, what does that make the rebels in Star Wars?
Wouldn't that kind of make it the American public?
Well,
Or
I mean, it's open to interpretation, right? And yeah, you
yeah,
could say like the American public, but like the CIA is still an arm of us, right? Like
right.
we are in control of it. It is still a branch of the US government. And it is still a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, right? So, to say that it's the CIA against the people, you know, you could interpret it that way. But what's another way? And I'll kind of hint. George Lucas, the writer and director, um, actually has been quite clear about this. What it's supposed to be a parallel of.
I'm not sure.
It's the Viet Cong.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. I can see that then.
Star Wars is a Vietnam War parallel. Now you can see even something that like sticks with us today. I mean, the only reason why Star Wars is such a cultural thing today is really because its sequels managed to be good. Um, I mean, Star Wars when it came out in 1977 was a phenomenon. It was the highest grossing movie of all time at that point, and actually, if you adjust for inflation, um, depending on how you calculate for inflation, it actually beats most movies that have beaten it since. Um, the Because the box office was just crazy. People were going to see it, 4 or 5 times in a row. And the only movies that really beat it in terms of inflation, calculating for inflation, are Titanic, Gone with the Wind. Gone with the Wind is the highest grossing movie of all time when adjusted for inflation. Um, but then there's also one further one that we've talked about in this class that it depends on how you calculate for inflation, which actually might beat Gone with the Wind, but they didn't measure box office the same way back then. 1915 was Birth of a Nation. So Star Wars is that big, right? But it has this subtle kind of like Vietnam War parallel. So even fun movies like that have this cultural malaise built in, and you can see it even in Darth Vader's costume in the first movie versus Empire Strikes Back, where he's a lot cleaner. Everything's a lot cleaner. On the first movie, everything's dirty, and that's purposeful. Like, Lucas, for instance, famously would literally take a shovel of dirt and throw it at costumes and tell his workers to make it look good. So the while you might watch it today for just being fun, try to think of these things in their cultural context, because it makes you realize how important the movie was. It was finally some sort of escapism that still dealt with the problems of the 70s and yet allowed people to escape. Now, we don't have time to discuss any further. But the hopefully you guys kind of see how important the 70s were, how pivotal they were. And we'll talk about probably the biggest political movement of the 70s, the Equal Rights Amendment, in the next session. So Have a good day, everyone.